Penny Peters, who is with Akwesasne Travel. Thank you, Penny.
Honored to be following Leon and kind of, talk along the same lines. Just some history for those of you who don't know where Akwesasne is. We are an international community. We are located right on the border of Canada and US, and our territory is not only split by that international border, but we also have parts of our territory in Quebec and Ontario. So we have the pleasure of living with international borders that have kind of been placed across our community throughout time, and we deal with that on top of everything else as a community. So just to fill you in, Akwesasne Travel is a tourism initiative that we started about 5 years ago. We've always been a part of tourism, being, Indigenous people, welcoming people, sharing who we are. And in the past, probably close to 15 years, we've really looked at tourism and sort of how do we define this? How do we make it, beneficial for both our community as well as sharing the information? And so we received a grant 5 years ago to really get it going. A lot of it was training our suppliers who we would have as part of this initiative. And a big, huge part of it that took longer than what we initially thought it would was community outreach and making sure that our community knew what we were doing, what we were putting out there, how we're putting it out there, the type of people that would be coming here, how many people who we wanted to be coming here. We don't want to be Disneyland, but we do want to welcome people, and we want to help our businesses and our individuals, expand and be able to make a living off of the things they love to do, which a lot of times are culturally rooted. And so Akwesasne is a Mohawk community. We do have other people living here of other nations, indigenous nations. And so we've kind of got a little bit of a mix within here of all of that. We are part of the Haudenosaunee, otherwise known as the Iroquois. We prefer to be called Haudenosaunee. And we spread out right across New York State and Canada. And I'm sure that a lot of you live, if you're in New York State, you live right beside places that have Native communities around you. And so we're opening our doors. I'm actually kind of scattered as well this week. We're running fam tours this week as we speak. We just finished up a Canadian tour due to COVID. We've had to split it up so that we didn't have to deal with people crossing the border. And so we finished up our Canadian fam tour yesterday, and we're in the process of welcoming some media and some guests onto our New York State side, and we'll be running them through some tours tomorrow. And so we're just getting to the point of opening our doors. The important thing for us is being that part of it, being able to tell our story from the Indigenous people, from the Indigenous perspective, talking about our past, talking about what we've went through, and talking more importantly about who we are today, and that we're still here. We still have, our traditions, our culture, how we've intertwined that with the modern day, what's important to us. And again, that, we want to work with people, we want to partner with people. We want to make sure that they're telling the right stories, and that they can come to us and ask these questions. We're more than happy to assist with all of that and to start, breaking those barriers and knocking down some of those walls. On the Canadian side, it's a little bit more powerful for us right now, but it's a big time for Indigenous people with the information of residential schools finally becoming big headlines and news out there. And, this is something, when you research it, there's not a single Indigenous person who has not been affected by residential schools. On the Canadian side, The last school closed in 1996. You know, nobody had the option to not attend these schools. Nobody had the option to not be affected by these. You know, I struggle to speak my language. I am not fluent in the language. My father was. My mother understood it, but she didn't speak because, you know, her family decided that they didn't want them to go through this. And so with the loss of our language, we lose a lot. You know, imagine if you didn't speak what you spoke today and you had to learn a whole new language. You lose a lot within your language when you can't describe things a certain way. So our language is very important to us. We've had a huge revitalization. We have specific programs that our children are now learning. Akwesasne is very fortunate to still have a large, fluent base of elders who can help us carry it on. And so, you know, all of that is part of what we share, what we talk to people about. We have, you know, one of our suppliers that we just met with this morning, he's a wooden lacrosse stick maker. And so, you know, talking about his recent family ties to his great-great-grandfather's family ties to the tradition, and, you know, how that is still here today, how he's modernized it and is running his factory. So we have a lot that we want to get out there and share. We want to market it. And again, Native communities are very community based. It's like you know, when you look at a Native community, we're very, very family based. If we don't know who you're talking about, we know the mother or the grandmother of that person. So we always go back to our community. You know, there's very little out there that we're sharing that it hasn't been brought forward to the community before. And so, you know, that's just part of what I want to share in the quick talk here. Looking forward to being part of the in-person conference next weekend in Lake Placid and sharing more about Akwesasne travel. I recently joined the New York State Tourism Industry Association board, so I'm very excited to be an Indigenous representative on that board and bringing some more awareness within New York State of, you know, the communities that are around us. Yama, thank you.
Thank you, Penny. And I think our final speaker today.
Ed Hall.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ronnie. Sorry about that.
Well, good morning or good afternoon, I guess, in some places. I'm Ed Hall, and I was the tourism coordinator for the Bureau of Indian Affairs for more than 20 years. And I left that position in April of 2021. And I'm now with the Bureau of Trust Fund Administration. It's a very different area, but a very rewarding area, as I also learn more about the inner workings of the federal government and our trust responsibility to individual Native people. And I'm coming now on about 30 years in the federal government. And I want to say that, you know, being the tourism coordinator for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, I was very blessed to be able to work throughout the United States, and now recently be involved internationally working on Indigenous issues. And I also want to say I really appreciated the conversations leading up to this, because, you know, the whole focus of my work was about capacity building for tribal nations. And the work that the federal government does, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, has to work on a government-to-government basis with tribes. And that's a distinction that a lot of people don't understand. The Indian nations within the United States have a political status with the federal government. So although we're referenced as minorities, we have a political status that is not necessarily, was absolutely not lump us into that group. And there are distinct responsibilities that the federal government has with tribal nations. And as Penny was talking, they have a unique status in the sense that they have crossed a nation, but they're not the only tribe that has relatives on the other side of the border, you know. And so when we look at the United States and we look at Indian country, as we call it, these borders are fluid, you know, as far as our cultures go. And in working for many years, I think one of the most informative experiences I had was with the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial. We had to put together the involvement and engagement of the trail tribes, they were called, the tribes that were along the Lewis and Clark Trail for the bicentennial. At that time, they called it a celebration. And the Department of Interior wanted to make sure that the tribes were a part of that celebration. And so over time, my office then became part of the Interior effort. And once I was brought to the table, they said, okay, we've got the tribes now at the table. And I had to explain to the folks there that I worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, that this was a federal engagement. But there was, even though I'm Native, I'm a Rickaron Hidatsa from North Dakota, I do not represent Indian country. You know, that only Indian country can represent Indian country, and that we had to reach out and engage the tribes to assess whether they wanted to participate or not, and that would be their own decision. So as a result, we had meetings, regional meetings and individual meetings with all of the trail tribes to get them to look at their engagement. We worked with the Bicentennial Council, and they agreed to bring on Native voices into the council. Over time, they agreed that the tribal side of the story was going to be their #1 priority, which was unprecedented. We had a number of very famous authors who were working with us and film, Ken Burns and Dayton Duncan. We had Ambrose, Rhonda, a whole host of folks. And, you know, there was a bit of a controversy from the scholars as to why we were looking at the tribal side of the story when Lewis and Clark had already written the story. You know, they had documented it. So therefore there was, and especially because the tribal side was oral history, they did not want that incorporated at the same level. But we were able to get Stephen Ambrose and Rhonda and Ken Burns, Dayton Duncan to support us in that. And, you know, one of the most important aspects of the bicentennial was individual tribes being able to provide their own perspectives on the story, but more importantly, correct misinterpretations or things that were not correct in the Lewis and Clark journals. Because you had so many layers of interpretation happening at the time, there were a lot of mistakes. And so, you know, the other thing that we found was 200 years is not a lot of time. So there were a number of elders within these communities that stepped forward to talk about the history they remembered, because they knew people who were alive during that time of Lewis and Clark. You know, so they were having that direct story. And what was really important about that was that they stepped forward to talk about this, but even the people in their own families, let alone their own communities, didn't know these stories. You know, because as Penny has referenced in regard to the residential schools, we have a long history of policy of the federal government to suppress or to not have us know our language or have access to our cultural history, our traditions. And so in the United States, we had the boarding schools, and just like the residential schools, I'm also on the board of directors for the Carlisle Indian School project, where we're working to do an interpretive center on the boarding school era and talk about the genesis of the boarding schools in general. You know, the theme of that time was to, number one, there were a group in upstate New York called, they call themselves the Friends of the Indian around Lake Mohawk. And they came together once a year at this estate on Lake Mohawk to talk about the Indian problem. And so they decided, one of the first major things they decided was that we were human beings. And that was a very, very important thing at that time, because if we were human, then they could not condone and wanted to do away with the hunting of our pelts for bounty. So that's where the term Redskins comes in, because you could sell a pelt of a native person for bounty and receive money for that. But if we were human beings, then what they needed to do was educate us and bring us to Christ. And so that's where the boarding school started. And the theme that they had at that time was kill the Indian, save the man. The idea was to destroy who we were as Native people. It wasn't kill us physically, it was kill the culture in us and civilize us, so that we would be acceptable and civilized in their terms. And so you layer all of that now in terms of talking about tourism and looking at our tribal communities and what makes us unique and what do we have to share ourselves. We're the commodity, it's our culture, it's our people. Who's our audience? Our audience really isn't the domestic audience, it's the international audience. There are quite a few, there are some people domestically who are interested in Indian culture and Indian peoples, but really it's international. And so as we look at that, a lot of what they want to learn and want to see, though, is who we were in the 1800s. And when they come to the United States, they want to ask you, if you're in New York City, if you're in Atlanta, Georgia, or Los Angeles, wherever, tell us about who was here first. You may not have a Native person there close by. You probably do, but you wouldn't know it. But the bottom line is, there's an interest in that history, as Leon was talking about, that predates Columbus. And so, one of our important things is for us to be able to tell that story ourselves, to own our own narrative, to own our own industry. And those are some of the things that we really fought to do in creating our tourism initiative within the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Was to provide the tools and resources to help tribes build their infrastructure so that they would have and be able to do the things that Penny is doing to own their own industry. And so when we start talking about our culture, our traditions, and sharing it in this industry, it's also important that we understand the role of governments, tribal governments, because when we come into a tribal community, it's like you go into any other place. Tribes have the right of their own law enforcement, so they have the right to set the standards and the protocols for the industry on their land, and they have the right to enforce that. So it's understanding how to respect that, and so it's also important then that tribes have their codes and their legal infrastructure in place to enforce those things as well. And so when we talk about sharing our culture, it's important then that we understand that that's our intellectual property, that's our cultural property we're talking about. So how do we set the framework to protect that? So you're not taking our stories and going and making a movie or writing your own book. You know, that's ours, and that's ours to tell. And so, as Leon said, he was looking to find Native voices to tell their story as a part of that bigger framework of pathways, right? We have so many different ways to look at our history and look at our individual stories. You know, we have our tribal communities that are on reservation lands, but we have a history of relocation, boarding schools, all of those things that took people off and away from their homelands. And so, you know, we have the urban Indian stories. We have all kinds of different communities that have sprung up since then. And, you know, to make a really good point, what Penny was talking about too, is that she has to work within her community to not only talk about how you support an industry, but it's how you are a part of that industry. So that we have the mom and pop businesses, we have the kind of ability to highlight our artists, our folks that can do these different aspects, but also make a living doing it, you know, and make that a part of the overall experience. But, you know, tourism has to work for a community, and we can't be we can't be controlled by the industry either, you know. So if a community feels that tourism is taking over, or that everybody is only there for the visitor, and we're losing our sense of self as a community, then that's another danger. And so, like, understanding how impacts happen is something that's really important, so that we educate the visitors before they come, so they understand protocol, and we are able to mitigate negative impacts on our culture. You know, that's a very important part of tourism development for any community. And I think that, you know, when we look at COVID, COVID exposed a number of things, but one of the things that made the news was how little infrastructure Indigenous communities had to deal with this impact of COVID. And then now, looking at recovery and looking at developing an industry, you know, there's a higher bar to climb to develop the infrastructure, not only for your own people, but then for visitors coming in. So, you know, that opening up of tribal communities at post-COVID is going to be something that's going to take a lot of investment of time, money, but I think individual initiative, how do you put it? When you look at a number of the communities that don't have electricity, don't have broadband, don't have, you know, the kind of transportation infrastructure and stuff for their own community, how do they then provide for a visitor? You know, so it's like, for a lot of communities, it's basic infrastructure. And so I hope that we're able to learn from this and put that kind of investment in, so that tribal communities are able to enjoy developing an industry where they're improving their existence, but at the same time being able to welcome and educate other people. So I think it's really important that we have this kind of a forum, and I'd really like to ask Penny if she has anything to add, because I really admire her work. Penny, do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, I think Ed kind of brushed on everything pretty quickly out here. It's something we could spend a whole 2 hours talking about.
Yeah, that's true. Let me look at my notes over here. I think one of the things that's happening right now, you see all over, is the land acknowledgements, and a lot of people are trying to show a level of respect, which is really important, to say who was here first and give that kind of respect to the tribes that were there. Right now, I'm working with the George Washington University and the Organization of American States on an Indigenous tourism collaborative of the Americas. And, the heart and soul of that whole thing is that we were not stationary people. We were people who had vast trade routes, and so our trade of food and medicine went throughout the Americas. And so when you look at the movement of food, for instance, corn coming up from Peru all the way up to North America, the tomato, potato, all of that. Well, that trade of goods and medicines wasn't just about the goods, it was also about the development and evolution of cultures. And so our connectivity was something that we enjoyed prior to contact. And that's something that we have not been able to enjoy, right? So, this is an opportunity to bring us back together, to actually take a look at ourselves as relatives. And I think that's an important factor that a lot of us forget, is that, that intermarriage amongst others was, right now we are the only people that have to have a number. I'm enrolled, and so I have my enrollment number, and that then makes me a valid Native person. I'm my pedigree, right? And it's all based on blood quantum and these kinds of things. Well, our people had the Missouri River basin there, the Arikara, and we traded back and forth, but we intermarried all over, so there's no such thing as a purebred. And so as we look at ourselves and we look at each other, it's really important that we come together too, as Indigenous peoples, and join our voices together. So I think that as we work individually in our communities, it's also important that we rejoin again in connecting and sharing our voices and our experience.
If anybody has any questions or comments, we are opening the dialogue up to everybody who's here. So feel free to ask or share if there's something. And you could use that raise hand function, or you can do the awkward kind of unmute and see how that goes. Ed, I know we focused mostly on North America, and I know that that's most of where your focus is. But when it comes to Indigenous topics all around, is there anything that is there anywhere outside of North America that you think addresses Native and Indigenous tourism in a way that our mostly US audience could look to learn from?
I think there's some really important efforts that are happening, but they're relatively new. The USAID is now starting a new Indigenous initiative. It's being launched out of Panama, and the first country they'll be working with, I believe, is Colombia or Guatemala, one of the two. And then, you know, Peru has done a lot of work. Ecuador has done some great work. When you look at some of the most incredible landmarks that we have now, bringing the Indigenous voice in for the interpretation of those places rather than the anthropologists. You know, people are starting to realize that our knowledge is in fact knowledge. That's been a tough thing, you know, that people didn't respect. And I think that's a big thing for, I guess how you say it, colonialism, that the idea of diminishing people, a whole group of people, into being subhuman is something that just doesn't go away. You know, we talk about the idea of generational trauma in Indian country, but when you look at racism in this country, and I think it's really reared its head recently, that's generational too. You know, it's something that is so ingrained and so hard to do away with. And so a lot of people don't realize that there's this kind of inherent prejudice or racism that happens that may not be deliberate. It's just how we were raised and how we were taught in the schools, you know. And so you know, we look at that, and it's important then that that education effort really happens here to support tribal development of an industry that doesn't necessarily have to be how would you say, we brought the industry to the table with Indigenous communities with a collaborative, but we want the industry to be informed by the Indigenous communities, as well as the industry inform Indigenous communities, so that there's a recognition that the industry has to learn from us as well.
Amy is asking something that I know you and I have talked about on multiple occasions, Ed. I'll read it out, and Penny and Ed, if you could respond. So Ried's point about land acknowledgement, our county has worked with tribal leaders on the phrasing for the acknowledgement shared on the website, but I've also heard feedback through other forums that acknowledgements seem like lip service if there's not also a stated commitment. Penny's nodding. Penny?
It's funny because we just what we did with our Canadian tour, because we don't have a lot right now on that side to have offered a full 2-day tour or a full day tour, was we teamed up with the city right beside us. And so they held day 1. We went through the city of Cornwall, and then on day 2 we started with a center there, and then we moved into Akwesasne and presented our Akwesasne portion of the tour. And the place we went to just before that was called Ontario Power Generation. So it's a dam located upriver from our territory. And while we were there, you know, he talked about the dam and the electricity they make and how great and how big of a big deal this was when it was built, and they did it all without computers. And they have a wall there with Akwesasne and the relationship they have with Akwesasne, which in the past few years has been really good. You know, they've done more than just putting a wall and a plaque up there acknowledging Akwesasne. But for me, it's a different experience as a Native person living here in Akwesasne going to OPG. You know, because I don't see, you know, the greatness of this place. I see how much it destroyed, how much our people lost, how much this affected, you know, my grandparents living to my father's living to my living, and how much that's changed the landscape. You know, you don't think of things like that, you know, changing the way the river flowed changed what I eat for my diet today and what my child eats for her diet today. You know, and how we prepared those foods, and how she will not know now how those foods even tasted, because they're no longer available due to a dam that was built in the 50s. So while we were there, we had one of the participants on the FAM tour ask this very question. You know, here's this big write-up. Here's somebody who's not Native, who's part of OPG, talking about this great relationship that you now have. The apology that was given, we get a lot of apologies. You know, we get the politicians standing at the front saying, we're sorry this happened. You know, and we get the, oh, that was in the past, let it go. You know, let's move forward. Well, in order to move forward, we need to always remember that past and the impacts that it's making still today, and will make. We always, in Native culture, we always think 7 generations ahead. How is this going to affect the 7th generation? So, you know, not just my children, but my children's 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 children. We always think 7 generations ahead. And, you know, I think in the industry, that's a great way to think. You want to pre-plan, you have your 25-year project, you have your 10-year project, you have your 5-year projects. Well, that's exactly how, you know, we think with the 7 generations, and how does that affect them? So we do get a lot of apologies. Somebody like OPG, where our leaders are continuing to hold them responsible, where we're building these great relationships like we are now with Cornwall Tourism, and acknowledging, you know, in the future, what more can be done. It's not always financial. Sometimes it's just a partnership. It's something as simple as visiting the power dam and then bringing them to our territory and talking about the negative impacts that made, and now how we're working together in the future to make sure that that's always acknowledged. You know, maybe there's a future engineer in there who will now, when they're building the next whatever it will be, will think of the communities that they're affecting. And it's not always just Indigenous communities.
Ed, did you want to?
Well, I think Penny really did a good job there. We, you know, when we look at, for instance, during the bicentennial, the city of St. Louis, the mayor of St. Louis acknowledged the Osage people as that was their home territory before they were moved to Oklahoma. And that was a landmark thing. And they had a huge celebration and ceremony welcoming the Osage back home. And that was very significant for the Osage people, but it was also really significant for the people of St. Louis, because they didn't know that their own history, you know. And so when you look at the movement of people, for instance, now we have a big project at the Grand Canyon. It's called the Desert View Project. And so a lot of our landscapes, you know, we're kind of a one theme pony in how we look at tourism. And instead of looking at layers of history, we want to tell that one story. But in the national park, they've brought together the tribes that have an ancestral relationship to the canyon. And each of those tribes now have the ability of sharing their story, of their relationship to that place, that landscape, and in a dedicated area called Desert View. And it's an acknowledgement amongst each other. There's 11 tribes right now, that had to come together, and some of them weren't, have very differing perspectives, right? So how do we all tell our own story when there may be things that differ, you know, in who we are in our cultures? But we all had that relationship there. And so that project, now I think it's in its 6th year, and it was the Desert View areas over on the eastern side of the canyon, right by Navajo Nation and Cameron. And so that was more lightly traveled. It's the largest visitor area, but it was the most under-visited area. And now that we've put this together, it now has overflow parking. It now has all of these people flocking there because they know that's what they're going to find. And so it was really important because people needed to see validation that there was interest in a tribal perspective and a tribal story. And so Desert View, I think, is going to be a great model for other national parks and public lands, you know, because you talk about a number of cities that are looking at acknowledgements. It's how do you take that next step beyond acknowledging and inviting the voice back to tell that story and to be present, you know, in I guess validating their own perspectives versus being presenting what other people have written about us. You know, I think that you have a lot of information about us that has never, you know, that's been written about us, but not by us. And so authenticating the source of information is very important.
I have one more question, and it's kind of a two-part thing. And I want to also stipulate, Penny and Ed, by no means am I expecting either of you to be speaking for anybody other than yourselves as individuals. But especially in a place where there might not be a clear current native presence, where they're based on history, those tribes have been displaced, etc. I have in my mind a picture of a person who goes, "Hi, my name's Ronnie Weiss. My pronouns are he and his, and I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional lands of the X." Boom, and that's it. And the two parts are, one, if they really legitimately know that they're not going to do anything other than saying that, should they say that? And two, if there is a historical presence that's not there any longer, how can folks who are there now actually do something?
Well, I
think
think go ahead, Penny.
No, go ahead. I went first last time.
Well, you know, I worked under the Division of Transportation. That's where I started the tourism program, and that was all about infrastructure. And so no matter where you go in the United States, if you're going to build a road, if you're digging in the ground and you come upon human remains or artifacts, you know, those belong to somebody. And so you have to, by law, work with them to mediate the site. You know, we have the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. We have a number of things that are in place. And so it becomes then incumbent upon the state DOT or whoever's doing this, if it's a apartment complex or whatever, to work back with the people who have relationship or with that place. And it in many ways, there, you know, people know, you have your state SHPOs and things who know who ancestrally were in these places. For instance, the Seminole Tribe of Florida has one of the most sophisticated and extensive GIS systems. And so they work closely with the states throughout the Eastern Seaboard on where their ancestral areas are, you know, and so they have a way of being able then to be consulted with as authorities on these issues. And so I think that when you start looking at landscapes like this, it's not that hard to put that education together. It's just that we don't have it. We don't think about it as being important. It's easier if we're invisible. And so I think that the effort isn't that hard to go beyond an acknowledgement and finding out who was there and who still remains, or where you can be in contact with someone who can give you the information.
So Ed, I'm gonna push you on this. If I know in my heart of hearts, I'm gonna do nothing other than say, I'm on this native land and that's gonna be the end, should I still say that?
If you say I'm not going to do anything else, yeah.
Well, I mean, obviously you're not gonna say that, but if you know that like, this is the only thing you're gonna do, or whoever it is who's running that event, is it still appropriate and useful for them to make that statement?
Well, I think it is, because you may not have a commitment beyond that, but if you're at least acknowledging it and other people have that option to not only understand it, but you know, I look at tourism not as an entertainment vehicle, but as an education vehicle. You know, so you know, the more we're able to provide people the information they need about us to, you know, one of the things we learned early on, we funded going to Germany for ITB Berlin, and we sent Native communities out there to talk about their destinations. They didn't really have the product for that venue, but we created a Native American pavilion at ITB. It became the most visited pavilion in the whole Discover America area. And it won 9th place out of what, over 11,000 pavilions. But the most common thing was people wanted to see who we were because they thought we were extinct, or that we were no longer, you know, whole people, you know, cultures. And so the whole idea is that, you know, we have a long ways to go in educating the world, put it that way, about Indigenous people and who we are. And so this is a vehicle for that, a vehicle for truth. And if you can tell that truth, and you're not going to do anything but tell that truth and go walk away, that's still significant.
Yeah, that's all I was gonna say, is even that little acknowledgement raises awareness. You know, one sentence can raise an awareness, and that that is worth saying. Now, if you can do more, that's great. We understand that there's not always the time or the research for connections, but just acknowledging that will raise enough awareness for people to start thinking of that. It's the same as you would say, you know, this is the hometown of this person. You know, if that's significant enough to raise in certain places or towns, acknowledging the land and who was there before is just as much awareness.
Thank you, Penny. Jason, I think has a question that Ed, you would be the best person for this. I will add the word reliable. So is there a reliable central database or map of where Indigenous people lived in order to identify where they lived? So Ed, any resources to point people to?
Wow, there are a number of maps out there. And one of the things you have to look at is what's the time period of that map, you know, because it changes. It's like, you know, the movement of people too over time. And I'm just thinking the Bureau of Indian Affairs had a map published that was accurate up until, what was it, 1990 or so, maybe a little bit before that. And so there have been a number of tribes added as federally recognized, but they also had the state recognized tribes included on that. That's a good question. Let me take a bit of a dive and see what we have, because they were updating maps. There's a lot of historical maps out there that show where Indigenous communities were. Yeah, I'll have to investigate and get back to you on that one.
That'd be great, Ed, and we will definitely share that as we move forward. I want to thank everybody for being a part of this, our Flash Talk speakers, our Native Dialogue speakers, and yeah, Aurora just put a link, native-land.ca. So yeah, thank you to everybody, and we'll see you in the next session.